We know that there are different ideas when it comes to diets and nutrition, sleep schedules, workout schedules, politics, philosophies. Why wouldn't there also be different understandings of economics? And in this video, I would like to explain to you some of the different schools of economic thought. And most characteristically of how these different schools of economic thought differ are with their ontology, their epistemology, how do we know what we know, methodology, are we deducing things from certain premises, or are we testing in an empirical manner? Is human consciousness something we can model? Or can we know certain truths about economics in the world by just thinking about them? As well as the normativity. What are the policy implications and values that certain perspectives of economics would like to uphold? And the corollary is ultimately different policy prescriptions that differing economists would like to prescribe. So let's begin with the Austrian school, founded by Karl Menger and several of his students, Johann von Bauer, and most significantly Ludwig von Mises. The main tenets of the Austrian school are about subjective valuation and praxeology, which is the science of human action. This is the deductive idea of methodological individualism, which is that only individuals act and society is composed of many individuals acting interpersonally that create markets and catalaxy, the science of exchange. The Austrians also understand that intervention, specifically with money and the quantity of money, results in inflation and increase in the money supply, which kickstarts the boom period followed by the bust, where prices have to adjust to the newly amount of money in society. We also have the neoclassical school of microeconomics, which was founded by Alfred Marshall, and it emphasizes the idea of equilibrium, supply and demand curves. But where's the equilibrium in the real world, as prices are always being driven by different pressures of new technological advancements or supply and demands, but there's no fixed equilibrium. And if there is, it's so transient, it's irrelevant. However, this is the mainstream conception of economics because universities want to train economists to just pull levers in certain directions and manage society. You also have the Keynesian macroeconomic school of economics, which is essentially 700 level degree calculus. They use conceptions of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but there are no aggregates. It's just people in society. They argue that GDP is an equation of government spending, investments, savings, and essentially if you can increase government spending, then you'll have a higher amount of GDP. But Keynes was a non-Marxist socialist. He wanted his school of economic thought to not be a revolution to socialism, but the government spending to incrementally socialize society. And the logic of the boom-bust cycle for Keynesians is the inverse of the Austrian school approach, where it's the newly created money that creates the boom periods. Keynes and Keynesians argue that it's these animal spirits that are driving the cycles of the economy and requires government to come in to correct for this aggregate demand shocks. You also have the Chicago School of Economics, most notably Milton Friedman, George Stigler, and Frank Knight. I remember meeting a student of the University of Chicago, and when we discussed these different schools of economic thought, he said, "Wow, you're really anarchist in the wild here." But yes, there's different schools of economic thought. I heard that there's about 20 Keynesian economists for every Chicago school economist, and there's about 10 Chicago school economists for every Austrian school economist. You also have the public choice school of economics, which is most notably at George Mason University, where they discuss the idea that humans are politicians. Politicians may not be humans, but they are self-interested if they are, which means that you can't be someone who's able to take an office and think only about society. They think about themselves too. And this self-interest leads them to creating other policies that don't just affect society at large, but everyone, including themselves, to their own benefit more often than not. And you have the Marxist and socialism school, most notably with Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, socialism most notably is public ownership of the means of production. But they never discuss how you can have a deeper specialization, organization, allocate society's scarce resources without prices. Marx was most significantly influenced by David Ricardo and Adam Smith, most significantly in the idea of the labor theory of value, that the amount of labor you put into something creates value, which is also opposite to the idea of the subjective theory of value, that it's not millions of hours put into something that makes it valuable, but whether the consumers and the market participants actually value that certain good or service. That is why a market will always create better quality goods at cheaper prices than in a socialist society. And a very important distinction from pure Marxist socialism is fascism, or corporate statism, or corporatism. And this, importantly, is a variation of socialism. What fascism is nominal private ownership in the means of production, but the state determines really who's going to be producing what, at what prices, and who's going to be able to consume these goods in what amounts. Think of Hitler and Mussolini and their societies where they were national socialists, whereas the Marxists were international socialists. So fascism is just a variation of socialism. It's essentially national socialism. It's not anything that has to do with capitalism. Everything is directed towards the goal of the national interest. Lastly, I would like to mention complexity economics from the Santa Fe Institute, most notably with Brian Arthur and Eric Beinhocker. They focused on agent-based modeling and the markets as evolving and emergent non-equilibrium systems. And a couple videos ago, I made a video titled Why Economics is the Meta Philosophy. This is because when you have a certain perspective on economics, it will lead you to have a different perspective on politics and policy. But only when you can understand from the economic framework all the effects that certain policies have and what they cause on the economy and society and culture, then will you begin to actually understand why economics is so necessary for understanding civilization and the effects states have on it. Do societies need to be submissive to the state, or are societies an evolving discovery dynamic process? Can people really live at the expense of the state, or is the state living at the expense of every citizen? I hope you enjoyed this video on a brief introduction to different schools of economic thought. And if you can like this video and subscribe, I would like to bring you new videos on economics and civilization every week. Thank you.